Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Looks like we've had a good group here join. We're really looking forward to this presentation about AI value optimization today. We're grateful to have you here, and we've got a lot to cover, so we're going to just go ahead and jump into it. Really quickly, we just need to let you know that we are recording this session, and we're going to share that out with you within the next couple of days. So, Thursday or Friday morning, expect an email from us with a link to the recording. And then on top of that, if you have questions, please put those into the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your screen. That helps us keep good track of them, and then we can address them at the end of the webinar if we don't get to them throughout the webinar. So just encourage you highly to ask your questions if you have them. So those are the housekeeping items. We're excited and really grateful to have Brian presenting to us today. He's amazing. We love Brian a lot. And without any further ado, I'm going to pass it to him so we can get started. But Brian, do you want to give a quick intro real quick?
Yeah, so delighted to have everyone here. So I've been in IT asset management and the evolving world around this for over 20 years now. So from doing licensing consulting to strategic consultancy, and in the last recent part, have been overseeing our technology and program transformation line of business at Anglepoint, which includes our ServiceNow Flexera practices, as well as our FinOps, GreenOps, and program transformation. So what we're seeing is this evolution of all of these different areas come together, and excited to talk to you more about that today. Perfect. So do you want to kick off, Braden?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. So we have a quick poll question to get started. Let us know what is your best estimate of your organization's AI spend over the next 12 months? That's under 250,000, 250 to 1 million, 1 to 5 million, 5 to 10 million, more than 10 million, or we don't have a clear estimate. So we'll give everyone about 30 more seconds or so to get those answers in. Okay, we'll go about 10 more seconds. I'm still seeing a few come in here. Uh, there we go. Anything that stands out from those results, Brian?
Yeah, I think it's we don't have a clear estimate. I think that's what we're seeing from a lot of people is actually if you were to ask 12 months ago, would people have been able to give a good view? And now I think what we're seeing is people starting to try and understand and forecast and what that means. So I think what we're representing here is people at different stages of that kind of forecasting view.
Awesome.
Perfect. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, there's kind of three main focus areas of, first of all, we're going to kind of touch on the market shift, what's happening out there, what's changed. And I think, a lot of people that have been in technology spend management control, this is probably the biggest inflection point and the biggest disruption that we've seen in our time working. So, it's a really exciting time, but there's also lots to think about and lots to keep ahead of. What this means, maybe for people in IT asset management or technology management procurement areas, what is the impact on us in our roles and what does that mean? And then kind of how to act. So what we're starting to do in terms of observing the market, talking to a lot of the analysts, and also where we're starting to work with organizations of how to get a handle on it and where to start. So first of all, kind of touching on the market shift, I think the big thing that we all need to be aware of is this is just the beginning. Um, what we're seeing is more and more technology vendors start to adapt AI as a core area that they're delivering through on much more consumption-based model. And what we're also starting to see is actually a lot of organizations who are very visible starting to question what AI looks like and what it means. So an overwhelming kind of feedback we're getting to the things that are happening is everyone just kind of hitting pause. So we're seeing the likes of Microsoft, Uber actually burn through budget very quickly and just hit stop and say, we need to get a handle on this and what does that mean? And what this is, also showing up is, there's a recent study done by McKinsey where 88% use AI somewhere in their organizations, and actually only 6% of organizations can attribute EBIT to AI itself. So what this means is there's this kind of value gap. So there's this spending, this promise of value, this interaction of where people are working and what they're doing, but actually starting to do that. And really the number there from 1.7 billion to 37 billion in 2 years is absolutely enormous. And that's the scale that everyone in this room and everything you guys are working on are already living with. So this is kind of what's happened in industry. And what it means is actually the different ways that people are starting to consume the technology is being turned on its head. And where this is coming from, really, it's kind of a fragmented AI cost picture, as we like to call it. So it's kind of 5 symptoms to this, and nobody owns the whole picture, I think, is the problem as you go to organizations. Every one of these 5 gaps have been created by people adopting in a very decentralized way. So if you think about how the world's gone from on-premise to SaaS and then into this area, actually the way that people can adopt technology is being done at a much more rapid rate, in a much more decentralized way. And actually, there's this term started to come about around tokenomics, which we'll touch on in a few minutes. But teams don't understand what drives that cost. Maybe people who don't realize they're spending a lot of money and consuming a lot of tokens on something which isn't business critical are maybe overusing, and then people are underusing. So we've got this gap between what's needed. And then the main thing that we're seeing as well is kind of policies. So people have technologies. What vendors do we use? How do we use it? How should we interact with that? How should one team work differently to another? And then we're seeing a lot of shadow use for maybe credit card usage, different business units adopting at different levels, different people adopting at different levels. And then finally, we're seeing with the likes of kind of Anthropic and OpenAI, where they're coming to market and then changing the models very quickly that people are consuming them through. And as well, Gartner have said that 80+% of organizations, of license vendors, will have an AI consumption-based model by the end of the year. So this isn't just exclusive to your OpenAIs and your Anthropic. Your Microsoft and your Oracle and your IBMs are also really adopting this model. So that means there's kind of faster procurement cycles. Committed spend is very difficult to forecast, and we're in this model where it's becoming much more of a utility. So that's led to this very fast transformation of how things are working and how we need to think about it. And really thinking about a timeline view of this, historically we were in compliance-led ITAM. That's not going away. We'll still have agreements. No one's getting rid of their mainframe. We still need to think about that as been a hardware infrastructure way of managing commercial agreements. We then entered this area where we're thinking about SaaS management, bring your own license, and really what this meant was a quicker route to the end user, less commercial barriers to adopt and spend and use that. And now what we're seeing is kind of the end game of that model, where you've got this, personalization and autonomy, where people then have complete control over essentially spending money on behalf of the organization. But there aren't those barriers in place, which were very naturally in place a couple of evolutions ago. So what we're seeing is everyone's need to stay up with that, and to keep a handle on this as we enter this AI era. And the other important thing to consider is this isn't just the AI vendors that we think about. This is actually every technology vendor. So even your Salesforce, your ServiceNows are all entering this model where it's this seat and consumption, this token-based model, this outcome view, and this is something which has really been adopted across the board. So from a governance, from a control standpoint, everything's catching up where they're still based and built for that left-hand view, and really everyone needs to get to this right-hand view where it's much more dynamic and much more forward-thinking, and not thinking about getting ready for that next 3-year renewal, but really getting to this dynamic real-time alert-based model, which leans much more into the FinOps best practice and way of working. In terms of what this means, we come back to this tokenomics term, which has become very vogue since FinOps X a number of weeks ago. And really, what we're interpreting this to mean is actually you've got a distributed cost in multiple areas. I won't go into all of these in detail as you can see it, but actually if we dig into a couple, the first one being model interactions. So there are very different ways across all of the different technologies where you can use a different type of model. and some are highly complex and will burn through tokens and spend money very, very quickly. Some are much simple and are designed for much lightweight tasks. Likewise, if you're to use Gemini versus OpenAI, they also consume tokens in a very different way, and maybe for data work can be much more efficient. So really what we're starting to think about there is actually how do we start to route our users in the right way so they're using the right model in the right terms for the right means. And again, how do we make this a process and governance interaction that the user has, rather than leaving this down to the user, where that's not going to be optimized and not going to be the most efficient way to do things. The challenge that we're seeing consistently as we're starting to engage is most organizations can see one or two of these, but actually getting a handle on all six of them is very, very difficult, especially when we start to get to these integrated systems that people are using across more areas and having that with the kind of desktop type applications. And then weighing this off then against the biggest risk of all, which is being losing innovation. The reason that we have this technology is because we want people to innovate. The things that teams and departments are producing are amazing. Maybe we can't justify that on the EBIT yet, but certainly talking to where we're interacting with organizations, how do we keep all of this moving and keep control without limiting people innovating and moving forward? So how we start to look at this then is actually we've got these kind of three main buckets of usage, where we've got the compute and infrastructure. How are we starting to consume that, and what does it mean across these models and tokens and AI-enabled SaaS? But really what we're seeing is this growth of the right-hand side, where we have this shadow and unmanaged AI. So really what's sold in the market is the kind of visibility to get a handle on what that means. And what we need to do is take that right-hand group and then put that decision back with the business so we can start to make some proactive decisions around what we're seeing, who needs to have that, and what does it mean. And most organizations are running all of these, and what we're seeing again is a lack of ownership. So there isn't a vendor manager often for Anthropic or OpenAI or these areas, or they're very much built around the negotiating a license agreement or having a term. So this is where we need to adopt much more of those FinOps methodologies around having a handle on that proactive usage and starting to get it control. And then what we're seeing is this next piece where we're getting this kind of six versions of the same problem. And if we think about, again, coming from an ITAM perspective, we have overspending of renewal. We have subscriptions for the team that left a year ago, and we're still subscribing against that. But what we're starting to see is actually that immediate realization of how can we get to proof of value, and how can we start to see what this means. And what we often see again is there are maybe 6-point solutions for these different areas. And the key to unlock here is how we start to get a handle on seeing all of these at one level and a business unit view. So actually you have this tech stack and this technology value which is being consumed across all of these different buckets. And how do we start to get a handle on which one of these are being seen? So you have all of these different investment pots, but actually we have a booking management system, we have a business unit, we have an internal team, and they have a tech stack consumption of all of these areas. So we're not thinking about Microsoft as a vendor anymore, but actually what proportion of Microsoft is being used and how are we starting to get into these. And again, from a SAM ITAM perspective, this is something that we know to handle, we know to track, we know how to manage, we know how to have the tools, and we know how to stand up the governance for. How do we now partner with FinOps departments? How do we partner in a more proactive way to get a handle on this and just give visibility and control so people can make their own decisions? What we then start to think about is actually how do we start to optimize that technology across the estate. So interesting, we had an offsite last week for all of our licensing specialists. And we said we had Oracle, IBM, Microsoft, and also more of our FinOps specialists in the room, and said, put your hand in the air if your vendor that you manage touches all of these different areas. What we're now seeing is they're all touching that. So if you take the mainline vendors, they have AI, they have cloud, they have traditional software, they have much more infrastructure, and they have endpoint software. And really what we need to get a view is this switch to your business, and how can we start to carve up that spend to get to that tech-led view, and we can start to think about what the focus is. So what does value mean to your organization? Do we want to optimize costs? so spend less. And again, what we're seeing a lot is that's not necessarily the initial place. It's get a handle on it, get visibility, link spend to value, and actually cut unnecessary cost, but not cut cost because that means you're cutting innovation, and that's not what people want. And really, what we're looking at those two middle ones of actually how do we tie that technology investment to the measurable outcomes and the goals, and how do we get capability to actually see, what a team is working on, what that project links to, what that person is doing, what that initiative looks like, and how we can start to get that back to value. And then actually we build a model that can do that more at scale. Because actually, if we're sat on a richer set of data, that can become an LLM, and that can become a more programmatic way of looking at something instead of just one person working away on their own. And what we're finding as we're starting to analyze this is huge outliers. We're going to have departments or teams that we wouldn't expect big spend from, actually pockets of high spend there, and maybe areas that we do want people in, like our subject matter experts, and we want those people to download their expertise into these systems to make it more scalable. Maybe they're a bit more resistant. So what we're starting to get then is visibility around who's controlling it and what that looks like and what it means. And then the final piece there is risk. So what we're seeing is actually contractual exposure of overspend, and actually things like governance, security, compliance, and increasingly green ops is coming up a lot of actually as we're starting to burn through these tokens. What is our CO2 emissions if we're a regulated industry, and how can we start to get a view? So what are the levers that we want to start to pull? And how can we start to get a handle on them across the board? But really, more importantly, what does this mean for your organization? And how are we starting to pull in all of these different technology consumption areas and mirror them to your organization? And that's where this AI piece can become key, and actually say, well, what is this department's function? And does that match to what they're doing and how they're trying to move forward? And is this something that we want to have very wide guardrails on and actually let them do anything? Or actually these people, maybe it's not as strategic a function. We want to start to manage that and we want to control that. So what do we do about it? This is the $1 million question that everyone's starting to look at now a lot. And what we're starting to realize is everybody needs more than one team. So Gartner did some really interesting research recently, which is actually ITAM and FinOps practices that manage cloud-based AI will reduce AI expenses, because what we're starting to see is actually these two teams can work in very different ways. ITAM are very good at getting executive buy-in. We, one of the reports is I think it's 50 to 60% of executive teams are engaged with FinOps as best practices. So we're seeing this kind of rise out of this innovation and working in an ad hoc way to now this spend is at a level that it needs to be controlled. So we need to start to think about this much more from a business lens. And this is where ITAM can really bring that value. And I think the other key piece here is you don't need to rebuild your operating model. If we have good cycles around how to manage cost to visibility, we have frameworks built, which we certainly will have in FinOps and in ITAM around what recharge looks like. How do we start to do show back across the different organizations and area? We just need to light up this new way of spending and just start to pull in different ways that we can streamline that and push that through the same operating system. So in FinOps, if you've been through a place of building out a cost hierarchy model in terms of what teams, departments, projects we need to manage and look at from there, this is the same model that we'll need to start to think about, and we can just use and push through to doing that. This isn't something that we're doing from scratch, and we can start to get a handle of what that looks like. We then think about where to start. I think the key that we're seeing is it's extremely overwhelming for a lot of organizations. And the key feedback we're getting from a lot of senior leaders is they're feeling this late, they're getting this information late, and they're starting to get a handle on it. So I think break it down and make it simple. So, add inform. What does value mean? What does the estate look like? What is our baseline of cost to value? And how can we start to surface those opportunities where there are outliers and we can get a value? So the outputs there will be kind of a value blueprint, an opportunity snapshot, and just get to work tactically. Don't overthink it. As you start to move into optimize, we think about kind of tuning consumption. What do the models look like? What does routing look like? So we can start to feed the right requests from users into the right areas. What does user enablement and training look like? And then how can we start to kind of stand up basic value realization tracking? And then in operate, it's kind of reducing the value, reducing the cost without reducing the value it delivers. So it's kind of what does monitoring value? How does sustain improvements? How do we start to get to a control framework and continuous optimization? But it's all very much those core FinOps foundations of showing back to those department leads, those budget owners, so they can make value decisions and alerts around what they're using, how they're using it, how they can start to manage that. The other challenge we're seeing is companies kind of jumping straight into operate before they do inform or optimize, and that's why savings don't stick and they don't manage. Is actually we need to start to think about why and what this model looks like that can be successful over time. And really choosing your route carefully is very key as well. So where are we going to jump straight into cost management? Maybe it's very tactical around Anthropic OpenAI usage, and actually where are we going to get into governance? And again, the feedback would be don't over overthink this. Don't get too far. It's 2 to 3 days around a room. Get the right people and say, what does Rev 1 of this governance look like? What have we learned from doing this in FinOps? What have we learned from doing this in ITAM that we can start to think on of what a request fulfillment approval process looks like for giving people the right access to the right tool in the right way? Where do we want to give people an agent that they can interact with that maybe we build centrally? Where do we want to give people open access to these tools so they can do that in a more ad hoc way in their environments? And then from a cost management perspective, what is our Anthropic usage? What is our usage around this? What does it mean? Do we have the right contract? Something that we're starting to do is actually start to negotiate with these vendors. If you're a large organization that has enormous spend, you can absolutely go to the table and start to have a contract-led vendor management type conversation with them to say, this is what we need this to look like, and this is what it means. And again, increasingly, that's something that we're starting to broach with the organizations. So in terms of kind of an overview of the services that we provide around this, we've stood up those four main areas. We can very much run a project or managed service baseline where we have subscription baseline and subscription management, which is very much around consumption, usage, alerting, control, and what does that mean? And then AI model cost analysis, where we get more into that right sizing and actually onboarding and offboarding different people from the right systems and management. And again, that can be tactically at the beginning in terms of which plan is that person on? How are they managed? How are they controlled? Are we right sizing that? Which people, are we aligning from job role to the expected spend and setting up caps in place of what that needs to look like and what it means? And again, there are big short-term savings, and then cost and then visibility around starting to give forecasted views maybe in month one, because something else that we're seeing the vendors do is actually make it very difficult to unpick. Besides that bar which goes up every month of your spend, what does that look like? What does it mean? And once we start to pull the API, connect to that and get a more granular view, we can start to get a view of what that looks like. And there's some areas that we can start to look at optimizing there. And then from a governance program perspective, it's very much starting on that left-hand side of, how do we want to manage this? Is this something we want to govern? Are we happy to overspend, to trade off with that management? And maybe that becomes a departmental view of actually we start to pick pockets of the organization and really empower them in our most innovative areas to drive forward and look at that. And maybe for more operational tasks, we start to invest in a more reactive view where we're starting to give them a view of maybe packaged offerings and availability, and then that all tailors to how much or little we dial up or down the governance around those areas. And then just in terms of an offer for everyone on the call today, we do have those services available. There's a range depending on the monthly spend that you've got for an AI subscription baseline. And then a strategy and roadmap workshop, which would be us sitting for a few days with you, with a consultant, talking about what that means, how this is to look like, where it comes from, and actually producing an initial governance model in terms of what should KPIs mean, what the policies and process look like. And we have a limited offer today to anyone joining the call who places an order before the end of next month. We'll offer 50% off our list price. So please send an email to the below if that's something of interest to you, and happy to get a proposal and a statement of work through to you.
Awesome.
Braden.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Brian. We're gonna just launch one more poll really quick. If you're interested in diving deeper on the services, I know that was a quick overview. Please let us know and we're happy to provide you with more information. So we're going to go ahead and keep that up for a little while you're responding to that question. We'll move on to this next one. We have a few more resources that we would invite you to check out. So I'm going to go ahead and paste some links in the chat to where you can access those. Brian, any comments on these two resources that we have?
Yeah, I think the Gartner article in particular we found really interesting. We've spoken to them about that quite a lot in terms of actually the role of different organizations coming together. So I would absolutely recommend that if you're on this webinar, it's probably of interest. That's a really good place to start in terms of if you have a mature practice in FinOps, in ITAM, where do you start to get a handle on that and what does it look like? And really, that one pager just goes a bit more into detail around kind of some of our observations and how we focus on the project problem. So a lot of the things that we've covered today, but just goes into a bit more detail around what that looks like.
Awesome. Perfect. Um, okay, that's great. Sorry, close this out here. I see, Chuck pasted in the chat that that first link might not be working for some people. We will share that out in an email afterwards, and make sure that everyone gets that. Lastly, yeah, as Brian mentioned, you can email us if you're curious about the offer that we're extending. Or I'm going to paste one more link. Hopefully it works. If you want to just schedule some time to talk with us about that, we're happy to do that as well. So fantastic. Okay. We're going to keep it up on this page, but we're now time for the Q&A. We've had a few questions come in. So, Brian, maybe we start with this one. Curious if there are any specific activities that you recommend that organizations can take during that inform phase to get started.
Yeah, I think it's just a case of understanding the user profile. So I think that's the key, really, is understand the departmental usage. And start to compare the spend by person and by area, and maybe don't have a broad brush approach, just pulling everything, but just start to get a view of prioritizing the people that do need access to this, maybe in engineering areas or in innovative areas. Is a good place to start. And then I think the other piece is just to talk and communicate. So get the right stakeholders around a room. In your organization, they'll typically be, how do you who has access to the software, who governs that process, what does your kind of fulfillment request process, decommissioning look like, and what does that mean for AI? And just sit around a table and say, well, what does Rev 1 of this look like? What rules do we want in place? What does this mean? And just get to Rev 1 of kind of what does basic governance look like, and how fit for purpose is what we've got today across those other areas that I showed, and how do we need to think about this differently? So I think just talk to your peers, I think would be the best way to do it.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you. Another question that came in. For how long do you think or predict that OpenAI and Anthropic will provide their $20 per month licensing? Any views on that?
Yeah, I think it's anyone's guess really at this stage. I think there's a very clear get people, involved, get them using it, get everyone seeing the power and value of the platform, and then there's like an on ramp to what that means. So I think it's a case of how can you use it more effectively, and we're starting to work with organizations around building their own models internally, maybe building projects and just user training and enablement. But it's very difficult to see. And again, I think our thought, and it's still very early stages with this, would be to tackle that on much more of a consumption, a contract agreement basis. So if you're a big global organization spending a serious amount of money, start to have those conversations of what does a price lock or agreement metric lock look like for a period of time. So that's the start of thing. That I think if you're spending seven figures with, you can start to have that conversation.
Awesome. Great. A couple more that just came in. Okay. Do you see organizations working a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 operation look to align consumption of tokens, avoiding sunk costs for Saturday and Sunday when the staff might not be working?
Yeah, that's a great point. This comes back to the model. The model that you're on and the agreement of what type of group do you assigning these people to. But yeah, that's a very good point, Rory. And something that is definitely worth considering. It comes back to alerting and trend management of what is our user behavior, how's that managed, and how does that controlled, and how do we start to give users what they need in the right way with the right governance that suits us.
Excellent. Okay, we'll go ahead and do one more. Um, so Chuck shared, we've kind of seen this
Yeah.
over and over again, with cloud spend, with the internet, now with AI. Any recommendations or thoughts on how we can get, attention brought to this before it goes off the rails?
Well, I think what we're seeing is it's getting attention. This is hitting sea level way quicker than I think a lot of other areas that we've had. And then I think it's a process of just visibility. I think that's our role as technology administrators and consumption management of how do we help our organizations contextualize this spend against our business and the goals and the value. So I think that's the key really is just tie that back to what does departmental usage look like? What does good spend versus bad spend? And then how can we start to um, show some wins and success around this as well and model that as good behavior. And it's different for every organization. I think that's a bit like the cloud spend. A born in the cloud tech company is going to be very different to a traditional manufacturing company, and how you'll need to use this and scale this to see value.
Nice. Okay. We actually had one more really good question come in,
Mm.
and then we'll wrap it up. But how manual is this? And then, how many, or sorry, how manual is this? And then how much of it is done with a tool? And, what types of tools are you seeing people use?
Yeah, I think it's mirroring the other areas that we talked about, really. I think it's don't over expect the tool to be a silver bullet. We're seeing an explosion of tools and platforms. Again, at FinOps X, you're seeing all these tools now start to flood the market in it, but that will always struggle to tell you what does value mean for your organization and who and why is that person using it. So I think tools will become useful. We're seeing Flexero, we're seeing the AICT from ServiceNow is a really interesting proposition. We're in active dialogue with both of those different organizations. But it's a case of the tool's role is to get clean information. You can structure that, you can manage that to get good data, but I don't think that stops in terms of do we want cost management? Do we want basic governance? How do we start to approach that and what does it mean? And yeah, potentially it is quite manual to begin, Chuck, but then crawl, walk, run, you grow into that and you start to move forward.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you. And thanks again to everyone who, joined. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to us. But expect an email from us with some links that are helpful, hopefully, and then also, a link to the recording. Thank you, Brian, for presenting. We really appreciate it. And we hope that everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thanks, guys. Much appreciated.